Hi, I'm Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar with Callie Crossley 89.7. But today we're talking about a little known, in fact, a forgotten story of history here in the greater Boston area. And actually, it's a forgotten American history story. I'm joined by my colleagues, Sean Corcoran. He's a senior managing editor for news at WGBH. Emily, hi, how are you? Emily Judem is the senior digital video person at WGBH. And Gabrielle Emanuel is a reporter who reported the piece about the reverse freedom rides, which we're going to tell you about in just a second. But in order to understand what the reverse freedom rides were, you really have to understand what the freedom rides were. I should mention that there is a very wonderful film by Stanley Nelson, which was aired on American Experience on PBS that you can see for yourself. PBS.org, WGBH American Experience, if after this conversation you'd like to know more about the Freedom Riders in the context of this conversation or just to know more about it. So the Freedom Rides were an idea spawned by the Congress of Racial Equality and then later on picked up by a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC commonly, and that was to test the Supreme Court decision that had said that it is unconstitutional to separate the races on interstate buses. There had been several rulings to that effect, but in southern states, they were refusing to implement the law. So these brave persons put themselves on the buses to test the law and to go into the heart of where the segregation was strongest and where feelings were deepest about this, and so that they could show to the nation that the laws were not being protected. Just to give you a few highlights of how dangerous this was, the young students who decided to ride as Freedom Riders wrote their wills before they got on the buses and sent them to their parents, assuming that some of them would die. The other persons who were on the bus, who were a little bit older, were long in civil rights organizations and had decided this is something they were going to do to really make the nation come to grips with desegregation and the rights of all citizens, including black citizens. Two other pieces that would be important to know, or one fun fact, I guess, is that John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis, is one of the riders. He was severely beaten, left unconscious on one of the buses during this process. The rides took place from May of 1961 till December of 1961. You'll want to remember that because the reverse Freedom Rides were the next year in 1962. Also, this was a period of time when the Kennedys were in office. President Kennedy was embarrassed by the Freedom Rides. He thought that it was made us look bad as Americans because, of course, the Russians and everybody else picked up on the fact that black Americans and white Americans who were testing these laws were being beaten, some nearly to death, just for the right to sit together on the bus. Let's see what else that I think is really important for you to know.
I had two things that
Yes.
stick out to my mind as key in terms of the Freedom Rides. And one is that it was a combination of black and white individuals.
That's correct. And actually all races.
All races.
But the point about black and white, you really have to pay attention to.
Yeah, and I think partially, and this is important for the context for the reverse Freedom Rides, is that the fact that white citizens had decided to go along with their
That's right.
fellow black citizens really irritated some in the South.
Well, I would say more than irritated.
Yes, and
angered, I think, is a word to use.
Yeah. And the second point I was going to say is that this was nonviolent, and it was nonviolent to the extreme in that even when these Freedom Riders were being savagely beaten, there was not any resistance. And I think, that's
part of the civil rights movement.
True, but I remember images of people picking broken teeth out of their mouth and having not fought back at all and being unconscious.
Right.
And
then the worst one that people mostly know is the one on Mother's Day in Anniston, Alabama, where the Ku Klux Klansmen would join with local law enforcement officials. They were supposed to be law enforcement, but they weren't, to beat or harass these riders, and they firebombed the bus. Not only did they beat the individuals, and they firebombed them, and they managed to get off just miraculously, because they all would have been dead in the burned out bus. If you see the picture of the burned out bus, you can't imagine that anybody could escape. So this is very important to know, and that the white riders were often targeted more intensely, if you can believe it, than the black ones, because there was that much anger that they would join with the black civil rights workers. So that's the setup for, now you're thinking, okay, well, that's the Freedom Rides. Well, what's reverse Freedom Rides? Remember, Freedom Riders were coming from the Northeast. There are many former Freedom Riders that live in Greater Boston, by the way, going south. Reverse now, Gabriella, it means something else.
Yeah, so the reverse Freedom Rides happened the very next summer, actually the same set of months, starting in May, going to kind of close to the end of the year. And that's when Southern segregationists basically decided to retaliate for the Freedom Rides. And what they did is they found African American families, particularly very large families, and they often looked for families that were either welfare dependent or single parent families, and put them on buses, promising them everything and dropping them off in particularly liberal northern cities where they would embarrass often a politician. And none of their promises of housing, jobs, anything was followed through. So these families were just dropped there.
So now, Sean, you first stumbled across the story. I can't emphasize enough that really nobody knows the story. I mean, until now. I mean,
Right.
It was really hidden and in plain sight. Yeah.
I thought it was a myth. So I was working on Cape Cod as a reporter after Hurricane Katrina. So a lot of people came up from New Orleans area to live on the Cape until they were able to return home, and many were living on the military base there. And at that time, I think that was 2005, people started to tell me stories that black people were dropped off in downtown Hyannis back in the 60s and with nowhere to go. And I tried to track it down. I tried to find out about it. Older folks didn't know anything about it, and I thought it was just myth. I didn't think it was really true. And then when last year, or maybe it was earlier this year,
Yeah.
when President Trump started to talk about his idea, he claims, to send undocumented immigrants to sanctuary cities, I started to think about this again. That sounds very, very familiar. And then more research, and I found Margaret Mosley, who is a civil rights icon who has her papers at Harvard in a library. Because I didn't even know the phrase reverse freedom rides. I didn't know what to look
Never heard of it either.
Exactly.
Yes.
So that's when I found, wait, this really did happen. And I turned to Gabriella and said, this really happened. And she said, let's go for it. And we just started to look into it. And it took a long time. We dedicated a long time to it because we found that we thought it was worth it.
It was months. You should say how many months.
Was it 5 months or 6
I think
months?
5 or 6, yeah.
5 or 6. There were a few extensions there, but it was the amount of material, and we'll talk about this, that Gabriella found. There are small articles around the internet about it. There might even be a little Wikipedia thing.
A paragraph maybe too.
Right, but no one had found people who were actually reverse freedom riders like Gabriella did.
And just to emphasize that, as someone who is fairly steeped in civil rights history, having worked on the documentary series Eyes on the Prize, I know Stanley Nelson, who put together the Freedom Riders film. We talked extensively about his film when that came out. Never, and the scholar that he worked with, some vague reference to it. So this is, people do not know this story.
It's odd, right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
it was in the New York Times at the time. It was a big story. The president talked about it. It just kind of fell away.
Okay, so Emily, you put together a video of the reporting and working with Gabriella about this, and we're going to look at it in a minute, but talk to me about just pulling all the pieces together and being amazed at the story as we all were.
Yeah, so I too had never heard of this story. And when I came into the process, Gabriella had already spent many months going through documents and finding a woman who was a reverse freedom rider who would be willing to share her story with us. So there were many months of preparation for this. And then when we actually spoke to her, she had not shared her story at all, I don't think. I think this was the first time she shared her story, which is really such a privilege and honor to hear because it's, of course, a very sensitive story and a very important part of her past and something that she was processing as we were reporting and processing as well. So I felt like we went through this process together with her in some ways, trying to understand her story and what it means for her life now.
And we're talking about more than 50 years. This is, this is quite a bit longer. So I want people to see the clip of the story that you put together called The Long Journey North, the forgotten story of the reverse freedom riders, 1962. So let's all take a look, and then we'll have much more to say afterwards.
We cannot change history, but we can make the history. Why can't we start making history now? My name is Betty Williams. I grew up in Herdick, Arkansas, and I'm a reverse freedom rider. When I came from the south to the north, I was about 18 years of age. My childhood was, some parts of it was very fun. Some parts of it was very, very sad. And when I was much smaller, I think those was my really good times. There was 13 of us siblings in all, and I am the second to the oldest. We always played like children don't get a chance to play here in this city. But then my mom didn't have anything there, no education, no kind of work. It was nothing there for my mother to do.
What do you suppose will be the ultimate accomplishment of this program?
The ultimate accomplishment, of course, has already been obtained, and that is to focus attention on the hypocrisy of the Northern liberals and the NAACP, Urban League, and people like that especially.
We intend to continue it until those people in the majority tell those politicians we are through with this foolishness about civil rights and things that you're using for political purposes.
Most of the people who came had only a shopping bag with perhaps one change of clothing, no money, knowing nobody. It was one of the most inhuman things that I have ever seen.
My mother was told she was going to have better everything. She was going to have a job, and she was going to be able to support her family, and her children was going to be able to get an education, be able to go to school. That alone was not the truth.
The first question that most of the arrivals asked was, where is President Kennedy? We were told that he was going to meet us at the bus.
She was actually told that the Kennedy was going to meet her wherever she was dropped off in Hyannis. She was thinking that they was going to be there. So she went to Hyannis, but I don't know how many Kennedys she got a chance to meet. So I guess when you get to be an adult, you just kind of block out things or things you just don't want to remember. I don't know what it is, but I don't remember a lot about the bus. All I know, I was on the bus, and I remember them giving me a ticket or something like that, whatever. I don't know how much money they gave me. I don't even remember none of that stuff. This is me and my mom. That's me, and that's my wonderful mother who is going on to be with the Lord. We didn't really have anything. We just had our clothing. We didn't have furniture, stuff like that we can bring here. I don't know, I think I was a little bit angry when I came here too, because I remember I used to go out and I used to never smile that much. I never smiled.
As I drove one family up one evening, the young son in the family asked me, where are the cotton fields? I said, we have no cotton fields here. He said, well, what am I going to do to find employment? I can chop cotton. I don't know how to do anything else.
When you come here, you have no education, you have no nothing to know how to fill out application about a job. You have no resume to put out there, but you just had to get out there and you just had to find where the jobs was at. When I first started working, I started working as a cleaning lady. And then I didn't know that all my life this is what I was going to be. We came to the Massachusetts with hoping that we was going to have a better life, and life has been, it has been good in some ways, and life has been down in some ways. Life has been a struggle, and life has been up. Life has been down. It has been all of that. Family got into the drugs, alcohol. We was introduced to things that we wasn't introduced to when we was in the South. It has been a journey. But the people from Arkansas that sent us from the South to the North, I have no anger in my heart against them. I don't want no hatred to live in my heart nowhere. I don't have no room for that. So I just keep moving forward.
That again was the clip produced by Emily Judem and Gabrielle Emanuel under the direction and support of Sean Corcoran, who found the story called The Long Journey North, the Reverse Freedom Rides of the forgotten story of the Reverse Freedom Rides of 1962, because it is a forgotten story. It's quite powerful.
It's chilling.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, just in the editing process, there'd be times where you'd be looking at this material or reading this story, a first-person account, and it would just, you'd start to tear up for what these people were put through unnecessarily.
Right. And again, for those who are just joining us, the Freedom Rides sent black, white, other races, riders to test the interstate buses north, and in retaliation for that, some white officials thought it would be appropriate or interesting, or it really played out their anger to send black people north with a promise of meeting the Kennedys, as was said in the piece, and also jobs. So, and their point was to make a statement against the Freedom Rides, and so these people are called the Reverse Freedom Riders. We have a couple of questions. Do you think other Freedom Rider families will come forward as a result of your reporting?
So in addition to Betty, we've been in touch with several of her family members, and some have decided to talk and share their story, and some have decided not to. In the radio version we produced, you'll hear from one of the other, her siblings, one of the other children who came up on the bus, as well as one of Betty's sons, who kind of reflected on actually the generational impact this journey had, and this being caught up in this kind of political game, as he calls it. There are several other families that I've identified and reached out to. One, I'm still in the process of trying to get a hold of, and the other one, as far as I know so far, doesn't want to participate, largely because I think there's still a sense of kind of humiliation, embarrassment that comes from having been part of this. And I mean, I think that in and of itself is a statement of how awful this was. Just that almost 60 years later, you still feel the sting of it when you think about it.
Were they, when you started trying to reach out to these families who still are not comfortable talking to you, are they understanding they're a piece of history in a way that maybe it felt a little bit bigger than just their own humiliating story, but it's like it's history?
Yeah, for one, I know they do know the context, and actually one of the interesting pieces of working with Betty, who was in the video and who's just a lovely person, was, as Emily mentioned, she was processing and understanding that it was this bigger part of history while we were working with her. And actually part of that process was bringing her a lot of the documents that we uncovered and reading them with her and making sure she kind of understood the full context. Because actually the family lore had become that they were freedom riders, not reverse freedom riders. So it was in many conversations with her that we kind of pieced that piece of history together.
And we should add, there are actually a lot of freedom riders who came from here and went south.
Yeah.
The follow-up question is, do you ever think a full-fledged documentary could be made on this subject? Of course, I know you're looking into a crystal ball, any of you, but you can say.
Throughout the process, we keep saying like there's more material here than we were able to include. So it does feel like it merits more.
Well, let's talk about some of that material you weren't able to include.
Yeah.
Well, our interview with Betty was over 2 hours long. And I think that, we spent a lot more time with her than that as well, just talking with her and getting to know her. And I think, there's many more stories. There are many more individual personal stories to be told on this topic. And I just want to add one thing, which is that I think that because the impact of this story, this larger story being lost to history, it has really shown in the families who were affected by it. Because Betty's family, for example, didn't have any resources or materials to look back on to understand the bigger story here. And so I can understand that they would think they were freedom riders because that's the story that has persisted through history.
Right.
But when something is left out of the history books, you don't know how to place your story. So I think there's that was part of their Betty's processing this throughout.
We had so much material, and it's really a credit. Gabrielle is very humble, but the reporting was tremendous, just tremendous. Sources would give her boxes of primary source material, letters, lists of people, where they went, what they brought with them, who was with them, the ages of people, who took care of them, all this material. She was able to find the segregationists down south speaking on the record about this, and a lot of that, we could use snippets, but we couldn't give too much of it just because we were limited. We did 2 8-minute radio pieces. We could have done, hour-long pieces with this. It would have been just as compelling. Even the tape of President Kennedy talking about this, we had to keep kind of short. And then there were decisions made, is this appropriate to put out there? There were people in the South who were sending letters, hate mail, to the folks who had decided we're going to greet these people and make sure they have food and a place to stay. And just horrific, awful things that you would never want to read based on stereotypes and such. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say we have probably multiple hundred letters, both support and hate mail that came. And again, it was in someone's basement, and it miraculously survived a flood. And we were able to, she gave me the box, which I've been working through. And we debated, and it was a long debate about whether to put up some of the hate mail that was representative of how awful it was, or whether we just didn't need to provide that platform 60 years later to people who had said awful things back then.
I also felt a real sense of obligation to history. I mean, 60 years later, we found this story, and 60 years from now, would you have been able to even find this story at all? So I was trying to balance that. Do we put this letter out there, even though it says it's historic things, for history, or do we hold them back?
Well, I always like to see those primary sources. So I'm with the person that says full-fledged documentary, and maybe it starts right here with you three and putting it together and using all of these materials, because I think you have much more to say. Let's talk about one of the things that you raised earlier, Sean, which we can now come back to in context, which is when President Trump first said we're going to send people to these sanctuary cities, it sounded preposterous. It just sounded preposterous. Like, who would do that? And so isn't it interesting, as always, history, provides such a context, to now think of it in the context of something that did happen. That just is a whole other space to think about that.
Well, Gabrielle, I did reach out to the White House
Yeah.
to find out if President Trump was aware that this had happened. He was alive at the time. He might have been aware of it. But Gabrielle also found tape of the president saying, "That was my sick idea, by the way. That was my sick idea."
That's
to
true. I
send
remember
these-
that. Yeah, I remember
Yeah,
that.
Yeah. So we, one of the things, I interviewed a historian about this, and he's the only historian who's written on this topic, and the only article really on the topic is from 15 years ago. And one of the things he said is he immediately made the connection when he heard about Trump's plan. His name's Clive Webb. He's actually in the UK. And he said he immediately made the connection, but the big difference, of course, was that then it was a fringe group that had this idea, and now it was the federal government.
This could have been a official policy.
Exactly.
Yes.
So that was a big difference. And we we debated throughout how much to emphasize that in telling this story. Is this story, and I think the answer is yes, valuable just because it's a piece of our history and it's a local history and it's a national history? Or is that context valuable? And I think it was helpful for us to have this historian talking about that so that he could provide the context in which we can compare what's similar and different.
The people who have so far anyway decided they didn't want to talk about it, did they feel themselves to be pawns now that they understand who they were in this, or it's more of just a personal embarrassment?
At least one of the families for sure felt that they were pawns, and that family in particular has remembered throughout history, throughout these past 60 years, what their role was. And for them in particular, it was hard to escape it. They didn't move all the way to Boston where they became almost anonymous, just one of a Bostonian, but they were more local, and thus the community remembered who they were, and they also remembered.
What do each of you take away from this? Both the experience of finding this forgotten history, and it really was forgotten, and also just the story itself. Start with you, Sean.
What do I take away? It's just shocking how cruel and awful humans can be to each other. And politics don't help.
But at the same time, there were
moments, yes, the way they were received
Yeah.
was this great humanity,
yeah.
wonderful people involved. But to listen to this vitriol from these Southern segregationists was appalling and sickening. It bothered me.
I think what I take away from this is that our history books are not comprehensive.
Oh, I could tell you that. Yeah.
I suppose we already knew that. But the fact that none of us in the newsroom knew about this story means that there have to be other stories out there that have just been lost to history that are really important to remember, especially as history tends to repeat itself. So that was my biggest takeaway from this.
And one of mine was partially just how long these same tensions have been part of our country. I mean, it felt like a story of the moment because there was this parallel with our current political situation, but it was also a story that the North-South tension, the racial tensions, whichever way you want to cut it, is a story that goes back to the founding of this country. So it had this story, an amazing ability to be kind of a long-term, long-lasting story and also relevant in this particular moment. But I think on the more personal note, one of the big takeaways for me was just how this was a short-term game these segregationists were playing and how long-term the consequences were for
Very important.
this family that did share their story with us. That they're still grappling with some of the consequences
Right.
now, which is
And we should remember, they didn't have any options to go back. I mean, once they're here, you're here. Now you got to figure it out, which is terrible. One of the, we have
It's
another.
also worth noting that in some cases it seemed like there was nothing to go back to,
Right.
because these folks had been told, you're not going to get any more subsidies, you're not going to get any more support around here unless you get on that bus.
Yes, that's right. Another question was, did the Reverse Freedom Riders go to other cities in the North?
Yes, they went across the country, actually. Some went to California, Minnesota, New York. The largest number came to Hyannis, Massachusetts.
And is that because of the Kennedy connection?
Exactly. So
Okay.
that was almost 100, 96 to be exact. But they were sent to big cities and tiny, tiny towns all across the North.
So you could find other people in California then, or
Exactly, yeah.
that
yeah.
you've yet to speak to.
Oh, for sure.
There you go on your full-fledged documentary. Because I'm wondering if those people, without the benefit of the whole Kennedy connection, which was the point made by so many of these people, if they understood once they arrived, just where their place was in this whole context.
Exactly.
In the same way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
Well, I'm dying to know people. You got to find out.
I agree. I think that it was very hard to cut this down, even with just focusing on Betty to 6 minutes. I think there's so much more to this story, and so I agree that we should talk to other people.
One of the things that comes up to mind, I just was at a conference at the Schlesinger Library, archives, of course, and
They're the ones with these archives.
Well, and I'm reminded the importance of archives. So I think we should all speak to that, because you're talking about, going through, finding a box in somebody's basement, what it means, Emily, to have the actual documentation, the debate over whether to show this or that, but that comes from having access to all this.
Oh, this would have been impossible. I mean, it started with a newspaper archive, is how we all got started and could find the names. But then Tulane University had a lot of the archives. The Rhode Island Historical Society had the archival footage, the interview that was not digitized. It was in a back room.
I've been there.
And the Schlesinger, as you said, and several others. I mean, this would not have been possible without archives.
Well, I always like to make the point that for people who have stuff in their basement and who have family members' papers, that it's important to actually reach out to archives, because all of these documents tell a story, and sometimes tell a story that was forgotten, as it was in this case.
Yeah.
And obviously, you're still getting other documents, so there's more to be told about this.
Yeah, exactly. So we've just had one of our Freedom of Information Act requests just came back, and there's a whole file at the Justice Department on this topic that I've never seen, and the academic I interviewed has never seen. So it'll be interesting to see what's in there.
And maybe some more names.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, fabulous. There's nothing like having an exciting story under any circumstances, but having an exciting story that nobody knew about is really, really exciting, and one that's a part of, as we say, greater Boston history and also American history. So thanks to all of you. Thanks, Sean Corcoran. Thanks, Emily Judem. And thanks, Gabrielle Emanuel. And that's the end of our conversation about the long journey north, the forgotten story of the Reverse Freedom Riders.